In the early 20th century, when two giants from distinctively separate disciplines collaborated on the development of an extracorporeal circulation device, I doubt they realized how extraordinarily unique their partnership was. At this moment, we are positioned in a fast-paced world, where technology is advancing and globalization increasing, where distances get shorter, competition increases, and expectations are more demanding. A time when we need to make the best use of knowledge and look at each challenge from different points of view. A time for transdisciplinary integration of the sciences. A time when convergence innovation is needed most. Innovative leaders are curiously optimistic as they dare to take risks. And when leaders work together, the capacity to innovate increases exponentially. The world's most complex problems require convergence innovation. Through this approach, we have the ability to live longer, foster a better quality of life, and preserve this tiny rock we call Earth. It's why we are here, for the benefit of all.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Steve Igo, here in the studios of DeBakey CV Education. Welcome you to Pumps and Pipes Houston Tech Rodeo. Today's program is on inner space, outer space, and the earth between. At past Pumps and Pipes conferences, we've talked about different parts of the body, the heart, the peripheral vasculature. But today we're going to talk about the lung. Can I see the first slide, please? Today is World Hypertension Day. And it's interesting that in an adult human, if you take the blood vessels and laid them in a straight line, they would measure 60,000 miles in length. That would circle the earth twice. And so today we're going to talk about blood vessels in the lung, and specifically we're going to talk about the blood vessels related to pulmonary hypertension. So joining me in the studio today is Dr. Zeenat Safdar. She is the director of the Pulmonary Hypertension program and the interim director of the Houston Methodist Lung Center. Also joining me is Dr. Ashrith Guha. He is director of the Pulmonary Hypertension program in the DeBakey Cardiology Associates. They will be talking about the treatment, diagnosis, and novel imaging of pulmonary hypertension. Dr. Safdar?
Thank you very much, Steve, for your kind introduction, and it gives me great pleasure to give a talk on pulmonary arterial hypertension. Thank you, Steve. It gives me great pleasure to talk about pulmonary hypertension. I appreciate your kind introduction. So we're going to go, as mentioned, I'm the interim director for the Houston Methodist Lung Center and the director of the Pulmonary Hypertension Center at Houston Methodist. This is the outline of my presentation given over here. Interestingly, May 5th was the World Pulmonary Hypertension Day, so not too far from the regular Hypertension Day. PH Day was just celebrated also. So what is pulmonary hypertension? It's a disease, it's a rare disease. Prevalence of this disease is about 15 to 25 people per million. It's diagnosed more frequently now, it's undertreated, underdiagnosed. In 1987, there's a rapidly progressive disease thought to be a kingdom of near death. Since then, a lot of advances has been made, and I'm going to go over some of the diagnostic and treatment modalities for this disease. These are just a list of all the studies, not all, but major studies which have led to the approval of a lot of drugs that we're going to talk about. But nevertheless, there's a lot to be done, and what is pulmonary hypertension is thought I was going to go over. So in a normal heart, the blood flow through the vessels into the right side of the heart, where then it goes through the pulmonary artery into the lungs and it gets oxygenated and goes back to the left side, and that is the pumping side to the LA and LV, and then through the aorta distributed to the part of the body. So what happened in pulmonary hypertension is the vessels in the pulmonary vasculature, they become narrow to the point that there is high resistance to the flow of the blood. That leads to shortness of breath, and shortness of breath is a very common manifestation. But if you look, this is a pipes and pumps conference, so I thought maybe look at this as a pipe. So if you have a long pipe and the blood is flowing from one end to the other, the resistance is in the pulmonary vasculature, which is the pulmonary circulation here, but the resistance can be anywhere through this. So the most important thing is to figure out where the problem lies and to treat it. Another way of looking at it, blood is coming into the pulmonary vasculature, into the pulmonary circulation, and then getting oxygenated. And as you can see, the kind of color changes from bluish to reddish, well oxygenated blood into the left side of the heart. And the alveolus is bringing in the oxygen, and there is no problem normally in us. But what happened in pulmonary arterial hypertension, there is increased resistance to the flow of the blood. And then it could be also due to a clot which can get dislodged or lodged into the pulmonary circulation. It could be decreased availability of oxygen or destruction of the alveoli, that is the lung disease and hypoxemia. On the other hand, it could be high resistance to the outflow of the blood through the LA. It could be because of the dysfunction of the left ventricle or left atrium. If you take out all these conditions and you focus more on the pulmonary circulation, then that is the main cause is idiopathic pulmonary hypertension or associated. And this is just a schema of thing, and I'm going over this because it's important to figure out what is the main cause of pulmonary hypertension that we are dealing with, and what are the different types which are outlined over here. Group 1 is the one that we talked about. This is the one where the main pathology is the pulmonary circulation. Group 2 is the left heart associated, where the problem lies in the left heart, whereas the lung disease associated is group 3, chronic thromboembolic is group 4, and then it's the miscellaneous. It's important because there are medications which we have available to treat group 1 and your group 4. But none for group 2 and group 5. But there are studies going on now that which are investigating new therapies. And interestingly, just recently, we have a new therapy available for PH due to lung disease, and it is an inhaled treprostinil. So in terms of pathophysiology, there's obstruction in plexiform lesions, narrowing, not just the narrowing or the dilation, but you can see that there's absolutely obstruction of these vessels that leads to really high resistance to the flow of the blood. The endothelial proliferation, there is medial hypertrophy leading ultimately to a plexiform lesion. And you can see over here there is actually a thrombus in situ within the vessel that can also lead to high resistance to the flow of the blood. And this is another schema. Normally the pulmonary vessels are high capacitance, low resistance vessel, which means that if we go to a gym and exercise, we can increase our blood flow and there's no problem. But in patients with pulmonary hypertension, they cannot increase accommodate the high flow of the blood in the pulmonary vasculature. So this is another schema showing that as the pulmonary artery pressures are going up, as the PVR, pulmonary vascular resistance, is increasing, the cardiac output is maintained in a patient that is compensated. But as the patient becomes decompensated, the cardiac output starts to go down, and now they can't do their regular activities and they are more short of breath. At a point where the cardiac output actually starts to dip, where the RV or the right ventricle is unable to maintain the flow of the blood. And you can see over here that in a normal patient, as the cardiac output increases, the pulmonary pressures, mean pulmonary pressure, which is on the y-axis, does not increase. But in patients with pulmonary hypertension, which is depicted in the black and the red from various causes, there is increase in the pulmonary artery pressure as the cardiac output is increased, suggesting that the vessels in the pulmonary vasculature is unable to accommodate that high flow of blood. Depicting over here also, as the RV is normally a thin-walled vessel, a thin-walled structure, and as the pulmonary arteries become thick-walled, the RV as a pump as the resistance is increasing, the pump has to, of course, work harder. So as the pump is working harder, there's hypertrophy of the vessel wall to a point where it says, okay, I cannot maintain, the pressure is too high, and the RV starts to fail, where the patient develops RV failure. A lot of studies, I'm not going to bore you with this all the details in this slide, but just to say that echo is the diagnostic screening tool that is used, and to confirm the diagnosis, right heart cath is the gold standard and has to be done on every patient. Now, I was told to talk about the targeted mechanisms. There are three: endothelin pathway, nitric oxide pathway, and a prostacyclin pathway. The endothelin pathway was discovered as it was a very potent vasoconstrictor, binding to two receptors, endothelin A and B, and binding to these receptors leads to profound, not just vasoconstriction, but proliferation. On the other hand, nitric oxide is a vasodilator, and then which is endogenously present in the vessels, and if there's paucity of the nitric oxide in these vessels, so that there is a reduction in cyclic GMP. But if you were to give us exogenous nitric oxide, or if you were to somehow increase the supply of cyclic GMP in these vessels by either giving them a guanylate cyclase stimulator that helps produce cyclic GMP, or block the breakdown of cyclic GMP by giving them a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, you will increase the supply of cyclic GMP in these vessels, which is a very potent vasodilator and an anti-proliferator. Similarly, the prostacyclin pathway, the reduction in prostacyclin has been shown for about 20 years now, so that exogenously delivery of prostacyclin leads to vasodilation, and you can either give them a direct prostacyclin analog, or they can be treated with a prostacyclin receptor agonist. So again, this is just the time course of all the clinical trials, but these are all the FDA approved medications which are available, targeting prostacyclin pathway, endothelin pathway, which blocking the endothelin pathway so that there is less proliferation, and donors of nitric oxide, which is given over here to increase the nitric oxide availability and production in these vessels. So you can see that there are about 14 of these medications which are available in these. Now, looking at the vessel, these are the smooth muscle cells, and the smooth muscle cells have different receptors there. As we talked about, the endothelin A and B are there, so blocking those is advantageous because they will then block the increase in phospholipase C that causes the increase in calcium, that maintains the vascular tone, is hyper increased, you can say, or increased sensitivity to calcium, so that there is profound vasoconstriction and proliferation. On the other hand, prostacyclin binds to different receptors, and different medications target different receptors and lead to variable amount of utility of using these. And guanylate cyclase similarly increase the production of nitric oxide and sensitivity of nitric oxide, and also blocks the calcium. So, the main at the end, it is the calcium increase intracellularly that leads to all these secondary things that happen in the cell. So, I'm going to skip this slide for the interest of time. Parenteral prostanoids are the first therapy for functional class 4, which are patients who are severely decompensated. And there are different receptors that the prostacyclin has been targeted. Different analogs have targeted different, as outlined over here, and that have proven advantageous in the treatment of pulmonary hypertension. There are many drugs in development. Which are now not FDA approved, but hopefully will be, depending on the results of the clinical trial, which are ongoing. The inhaled imatinib is one, which is a platelet-derived growth factor. Another one is seralutinib, which is also a platelet-derived growth factor inhibitor. Certain different receptors again are blocked by these. There's another formulation, treprostinil powder, which is once a day, and then there is, of course, if you can give them exogenous nitric oxide, that is going to be really helpful for these patients, but that has been difficult because nitric oxide generation or carrying a cylinder is very cumbersome and expensive. But there's a new device that is being tested. Ralinepag is an IP receptor agonist, another one that is being tested. A new pathway, which is sotatercept, it works through the activin and growth differentiating factors. It reconstitutes the pulmonary vasculature so that there is decrease in BMPR2 inhibitions and increased expression, trying to restore the balance of vasoconstrictors and vasodilators in the vessel wall. Another mechanism is ultrasonic energy to denervate pulmonary artery, which is an important, may prove useful in humans. There is some data in animal that it works very well. There are many failed drugs. I'm just putting a few of them here. So a lot of drugs have been tried, a lot of drugs have failed, but there are other things that we can do in a failing patient. We can give them lung transplant, right? We can give them 2 sets of lungs, and that will be curative because you're taking out a damaged lung and you're putting in 2 new lungs. But the problem with that is 90%, up to 90% may not be listed, and even if they are listed, 20% may die awaiting a lung transplant. And there are indications for referring, and sometimes these indications are overlooked and patients get referred to a center or to a PH center very late. So, and the reason why lung transplantation is not enough is because there is not enough organ available. So what can we do to increase the presence of these lungs? A lot of these lungs have contusion. A lot of these lungs are not useful. So then ex vivo lung perfusion is a technique which has been developed, and to expand the donor pool of lung and extend a life-saving therapy for patients. So 3 to 4 hour period, the donated lung are placed in a sterile plastic dome, and I think this is going to be discussed. They're maintained on room temperature. They're given nutrients, protein, antibiotics, even and of course oxygenated. This is a catheter that goes to the pulmonary artery, another catheter into the left atrium. They're perfused with a bloodless perfusate and then put in a dome over here at room temperature, make them viable or transplantable, and then they are given. And this has been done at many centers, as I mentioned, and there's a 25% of lungs in Toronto, at one of the centers in Toronto, have been using these as rescue lungs, and the 5-year outcome for these patients have been very good, comparable to the normal explanted or transplanted lung. I think Dr. Nichols is going to talk about recellularization of decellularized lung, which basically means you take the lung, you take away all the cells from the lungs so that the scaffolding is left, and now you can theoretically put the stem cells in there, the patient's own stem cells, so there's no reaction, and rebuild the lung from scratch. And that could be something that's going to talk about. So stem cell engineering is something that has been worked on, and repopulate these acellular lung scaffolding. Other thing is 3D bioprinting that I think Dr. Miller is going to talk about, so I'm just going to skip this. Xenotransplantation is something we take a donor pig, and it has been used for skin and kidney and pancreas, but what about lungs? This is done by Lung Biotechnology is working on this, and this is cross-species transplantation, modification of the pig genome so that the humans don't recognize it as a foreign body or foreign cells and don't have a reaction to it, and genetic engineering may be the next way to go. So in summary, correct diagnosis is very important, proper undergoing a right heart cath, referring them to a PH center like the center at the lung center, proper treatment, new therapies, enrolling them in clinical trials, patients, so that's how we have new therapies available, exploring new targeted pathways that I mentioned. Then again, novel things, if a patient is marginal or needs to be transplanted but we don't have enough lungs available, then increasing the pool of those patients may be something, and then lung regeneration and xenotransplantation is something which will be coming up in the next few years. So I appreciate your attention. I know I went through this fast, a lot of data to cover, and this is the Houston Methodist Lung Center where we take care of our patients with different kind of diseases, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end, and for feedback this is my email, zsafdar@houstonmethodist.org. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Safdar. Obviously, that was a lot of information to cover in a short period of time, but the endothelium really is kind of the gatekeeper in many ways to the lung and to the media of the lung. Dr. Guha will now talk a little bit about the advances in imaging of the pulmonary vasculature in pulmonary hypertension.
Thank you, Steve. So just to follow up on an excellent talk by Dr. Safdar. So as she, just to recollect what she said, very important to diagnose pulmonary hypertension appropriately, and the crux of diagnosis really, falls on echocardiogram and right heart cath, as she suggested. But why do we need newer imaging techniques if we already have echo and right heart cath? The problem is that we have, there are no tools for early diagnosis, and now we are having more data in pulmonary hypertension that earlier you diagnose and treat, the better the outcomes could be, and potentially even fully reversible. So I think that's why we need tools for early diagnosis. And secondly, the non-invasive tools such as echocardiogram are really very poorly sensitive. As you can see on the scatter plot on your right side, the echocardiograms it performs poorly in really diagnosing pulmonary hypertension, and there are a lot of false positives and false negatives. And thirdly, the invasive nature of the gold standard, which is the heart cath, also makes it imperative for us to have a different way to maybe diagnose pulmonary hypertention. So and also in terms of looking at prognosis, I think just the shape of the right ventricle and poor echocardiographic windows lead to a poor assessment of the RV function, which is really what determines the overall prognosis in these patients. So in terms of what are the imaging targets and the focus, again, the focus is both on diagnosis and in determining prognosis. And these are the different targets that people have looked at in trying to diagnose pulmonary hypertension better. So they look at targeting hypoxia, which is what leads to pulmonary hypertension, then into the endothelial and the smooth muscle hypertrophy, which is one of the characteristics of pulmonary hypertension, and the vascular remodeling which results from it, and the small vessel arteriopathy and the distal vessel pruning, and subsequently the end stage thing that we get, which is perfusion and flow abnormalities and heterogeneity. So different imaging techniques have tried to address each one of these abnormalities in trying to see if you can image pulmonary vasculature better, hence maybe diagnose pulmonary hypertension sooner and with a much more specific and in a sensitive manner to help them get to treatment better. So in this talk, we'll be quickly going over some of the MRI techniques, the CT angiogram techniques which have come along, and molecular imaging. So in MRI, we'll be going over the 4D and 2D phase contrast, and in molecular imaging, I'll be talking a little bit about SPECT and PET. So, as you all know, MRI can measure flow. The way it can detect or image flow is you can, the older technique is to use a 2D phase contrast where you pick a point and look at the movement of that vector along the flow. And now, we have 4D phase contrast CMR, where you look at a point and its movement, and both in the tissue as well as in the blood, but in a three-dimensional way. So people have tried to use both these 2D and 4D contrast CMR to see if we can diagnose PH sooner and also risk prognosticate. So this is the picture of a patient with pulmonary hypertension who's had, a 4D contrast MRI, and some of the parameters that have been studied. So what this really does is you are able to image the flow of blood through the pulmonary artery. So as we all can imagine, in a normal pulmonary artery, the flow will be very laminar. And when somebody has pulmonary hypertension and remodeling of the blood vessels, the flow is not laminar. You have a lot of turbulence, and there are multiple things which become abnormal. The acceleration of the blood through the pulmonary artery is abnormal. The time to which it accelerates is abnormal. The overall velocity is reduced. So people have studied each of these parameters and found that it is abnormal in pulmonary hypertension. But however, the gold standard that most of the treatments have been studied with is something called pulmonary vascular resistance, which is the resistance across the pulmonary vascular tree. And when each of these parameters have been compared or correlated with the pulmonary vascular resistance, they have not performed that well. The correlation coefficient is about 0.6, which is not that great. So there is, at least some more ways to go before this could become mainstream in imaging patients with pulmonary hypertension. So what about the quality of the flow? Like I said, so if you look at the picture on the right, that shows you the vortices. So normally the flow should be very laminar, and the formation of the vortices leads to energy loss. And currently people are studying if they can quantify energy loss. And one of the things which has been seen is this energy loss is in fact seen much in early stages of the disease, and whether this could be used as a potential therapeutic endpoint remains to be seen. So now switching gears, one of the groups of pulmonary hypertension that Dr. Safdar talked about was chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, or group 4 pulmonary hypertension, where patients have chronic blood clots in the pulmonary arterial tree and either undergo surgery or catheter-based therapies to open up those blockages, and also can get medical therapy to treat this. And one of the problems with this this disease state is trying to understand if the surgery, which is very complex and it's open heart and requires cooling of the brain, is successful, and what is the level of success. So this is where I think MRI plays a really good role, where you can look at the perfusion. And this is something actually looking at pulse wave transit time, which actually is the wave of the pulmonary blood flow, coming back, and you can see these images. The top ones are the one before surgery, one after surgery, and you can see that there is a big improvement in this. And the same way here, this is actually the flow, and you can see that the flow in the bottom is so much better. The red are the areas which are not getting blood flow, and as you can see, it's markedly improved after surgery. So, and as we talked about, the right ventricular failure is what really determines eventual prognosis in these patients, and MRI plays a really good role there, because it's able to assess comprehensive function. It can assess tissue characteristics, including fibrosis, and which really help us understand if the patient's going to do well in the long term. Now, switching gears to molecular imaging. As Dr. Safdar said, there are multiple pathways which play a role in the pathogenesis of pulmonary hypertension. So people have tried to see if any of those pathways or downstream pathways could be imaged. And as you can see, there are so many ligands which have been looked at in animal studies. And there is only one which is made into the human studies, and that is adrenomedulin. This is data from a phase 2 study which shows, that in a non-invasive way, we are able to, image patients who have pulmonary hypertension, and you can see there is a picture of the lung from a normal to one with diseased, and there's a marked difference in the perfusion in these patients with pulmonary hypertension. And last but not least, CT 3D reconstruction again is very helpful because it images the distal pruning of the vessels, which is very classic with these patients with pulmonary hypertension. So to conclude, pulmonary hypertension continues to be a deadly disease, and it's very important that we are able to diagnose this disease early. There are some diagnostic tools which are coming up, but they are far away from being anywhere in the mainstream. And hopefully these molecular imaging agents will play a bigger role in the future. With this, thank you very much for the opportunity, Steve, and look forward to the upcoming talks.
Thank you, Dr. Guha. If we can go back to my slides. So Dr. Safdar was saying that recently was World Pulmonary Hypertension Day. And the keynote speaker at that event was Dr. Martine Rothblatt, who is the founder and the CEO of United Therapeutics. I've been in touch with the folks at the Institute who put this program on, and they will be featuring her talk on their website. And so as soon as Dr. Rothblatt's presentation is on their website, we'll put that out in our newsletter and let everybody know about it. So it gives me pleasure now to introduce the introducer for our next presentation. Jane Grandi Allen is the Isabel Cameron Professor of Bioengineering at Rice University. She's also been a Pumps and Pipes advisor for us since the very beginning. And she will now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jordan Miller, also from Rice University, who will talk about 3D bioprinting of the pulmonary vasculature. Jane, good seeing you this morning.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So part of my favorite part of my role in being an advisor for Pumps and Pipes is to connect Pumps and Pipes with faculty doing really exciting research. And our next speaker, Dr. Jordan Miller, is the definitive example. Dr. Miller earned his bachelor's degree in biology at MIT, then his PhD in bioengineering at Rice. And then after a postdoctoral fellowship at Penn, he returned to Rice as an assistant professor. And he was recently promoted to associate professor. Dr. Miller has made extensive contributions to the field of 3D bioprinting for biological applications, including starting his own company, Volumetric, which offers a cutting-edge system for very rapidly fabricating large biological scaffolds. Dr. Miller is recognized for groundbreaking work in printing vascularized structures, especially for the lungs, but also for various solid organs. And this is the work that was featured on the cover of Science 2 years ago. Dr. Miller is also, outside of research, a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion activities in the School of Engineering at Rice. And finally, he is also an award-winning teacher. Students flock to his courses on biomaterials and microcontrollers. I know you will find his work tremendously exciting, just as I do. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jordan Miller to the Pumps and Pipes meeting here at the Houston Tech Rodeo. Dr. Miller.
Thanks so much, Jane. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone. Hey, everyone. Very excited to be here and share with you some of our work and perspective on this area. Let me just share my screen here. Can you all see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. So, yeah, I'm going to tell you the beginnings of this story, which really go to this science paper from back in 2019, as Jane mentioned, and some of the newer stuff we're doing in the lung now, and looking forward to the future. So as a disclosure, as Jane mentioned, I'm also a co-founder of our startup company, Volumetric, who's been commercializing this technology. So in our group, we're studying the relationship between structure and function in living tissue. If you look at your own body, you see how complex it is. And in biology, you have this, one of the possible ways to evaluate biology is in the mindset of form follows function. So the form of a biological structure, this could be anything from a protein's tertiary structure all the way up to an organ's shape or a limb or even the shape of the entire organism itself. It's really an evolutionary consequence of its function or the function of each of its individual components. And in tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, we're really asking the converse question. Will function follow form? So if I say I want to build a replacement organ, I want to make a lung that functions as well as the human lung, or maybe better, let's see what engineering says. If we make the structure akin to the human lung, will it therefore have the same function? And that's still an open question. We know that transplants work, and organ transplants going from one patient into another work. So we know that the same structure or a similar enough structure to your organs could work, but could we build things that will also function in that same capacity? And we can look at this challenge very simply here. What if I just take a slab of gel, and this could be something like gelatin, and we're going to put some cells in there, and those cells are going to be at very high density. This is akin to the density of cells in the body, tens of millions of cells per milliliter. And what happens is you culture this for a couple of days. So it's only 5 millimeters thick. And we have, tens of millions of cells in there. And if you cut open the gel and you look inside it after a couple of days, you'll see here, it looks like a slice of bread. You have a crust layer on the outside. That is where the cells are surviving. You're looking here at destabilized EGFP and false color. And the cells on the outside are producing. The cells in the middle, they've all died. And the reason they've all died is because this doesn't have much architecture. There is only material. And cells cannot exist in a packed, solid volume of tissue. And if you think about, one of the analogies we like to think about here is we're trying to design tissues and organs actually very similar to the challenge of designing cities for people to live in. With cities, you have regions, we'll look at Paris here, where residents live, the city blocks, but you have to have the vasculature. You have to have the roadways to deliver nutrients and remove waste. What if you lived in a city that had no roads? How would you get your furniture in? How would you take out the trash? It would be really hard to do, right? So just as our organs are designed with vasculature, this is very similar to how we think about the challenge. So if we just add a little bit of architecture, we just add some 800 micron channels going through, you can see that each individual vessel here is providing nutrients and oxygen to the resident cells. It's not perfect. We still have plenty of dead zones here, but it suggests a way forward. If we have enough vasculature, then maybe we can get enough cell function. And the first stage of physiology is just survival. If we can't get the cells to survive, they're not going to be able to function like they should inside of an organ. So looking at all of the organs in the body, the so-called solid organs, it's actually a bit of a misnomer. The solid organs are not solid at all. Things like the liver, the lungs, the kidneys, the pancreas, they have huge amounts of vasculature running through. In our lungs, we have the vasculature for the air and also the bloodstream. In the liver, we have the bloodstream, we have the bile ducts, we have lymphatics. This is a very complicated set of networks that exist inside the body. From a biologist perspective, from my undergrad, this was beautiful. This is amazing. This is inside of us. This is nature. From an engineering perspective, getting our lab started in 2013, this was absolutely terrifying from an engineering perspective. How are we going to make something as complicated as what's inside the body? So to build living tissue systems, to take the idea of will function follow form, we need to have blueprints. We need to have materials and cells that work together to construct the tissue, but we also need to have fabrication systems that can generate such architecture in a way that's permissive for cells. So we're using 3D printing. As you probably know, 3D printing has been around for about 40 years. People in our field in bioengineering are now adapting those technologies, we have been for the last 20 years, to work with biomaterials and work with cells. And we're talking today about projection stereolithography on the right, where we're shining an image, we're projecting an image into a light-sensitive liquid. This particular chemistry that we synthesize, where the light is sensitive to blue light at a certain intensity, and it converts chemistries, turns them on in the regions where we've shined light. So if we shine a pattern, that pattern is actually instantiated into matter by localized polymerization where we've shined the light. So if you want to make a chess rook, you would take these sequential masks on the right, circles of different size, and the top of the castle, you print the object one layer at a time, and that would get you the chess rook. Now, what about tissues and organs? Well, we'll get there. So you have a vat here where the light-sensitive liquid is. You shine light from below, and each layer is projecting a different image and allows you to build the structure. So using this technique, we've been able to make branching architectures. These vessels are about 1 millimeter in size. You can see that the gel is elastic. It's pulsatile. We're able to get arterial pressure supported in here. You could do something like this architecture in silicone. Why is it so good to do this in a hydrogel? We can do not just convection, but also diffusion. So now you can see in black, we have highlighting the vasculature. This is India ink nanoparticles that are suspended and are trapped within the vasculature. We also are perfusing in red food coloring, which is hydrophilic and diffuses freely through the gel. So this now looks like a new map for a new city where we have the vasculature in black, the roadways we're pumping through, and the resident areas in between, the city blocks, if you will, on this level, where we're going to put cells and they can get nutrients and oxygen. So that's all well and good, but our organs are extremely complicated. And this has been known for hundreds of years. We have here on the left drawings from Leonardo da Vinci 500 years ago, where he was looking at the structure of the lung. And you can see actually two independent branching architectures. This is what he saw, what he drew. You see coming off of the heart, you have the blood vessels going into the lungs, but you also have the ribs of cartilage showing the airways going also down into the lung. And as far down as Da Vinci could see, he saw these branches getting finer and finer and closer together. And we yet know that they never connect. You never want your airways and your bloodstream to connect directly. If they did, you would have bleeding into your airway or air getting into your bloodstream, both of which are fatal. So what we are very excited about today is some of the new mapping technologies, either CT or resin casting or fundamental developmental biology in the bottom right here, that is helping us understand what that structure is. Same thing with the kidney here. You have the blood vessel structure in red draining out into white, but we also have a whole urinary tree. So we really define the challenge as an interpenetrating architecture, which we simplified on the right here. We can put multiple different materials into these different vessel architectures that we've architected. We could now do this in a gel, in a water-based gel, using a mimic of lung architecture. This is not what the lung looks like, but it has the simplest elements. We have an airway. Here we're pumping in humidified oxygen gas, and we have a bloodstream. We're pumping in deoxygenated red blood cells, and we see them begin to oxygenate over time. We increase the complexity of this architecture, increasing the tessellation of this topology along a serpentine path. We were able to show that quantitatively that the blood was oxygenating as a function of the gas that we put into the airway, which makes sense. If we put in nitrogen into the airway, we would not get oxygenation quantitatively. So we have to go more complex, though, and this is really where a lot of these new mapping techniques come in, looking at just, we can't make a whole lung yet, but looking at the most distal architecture, you could begin to extract different types of topologies here, where these may be functional mimics of the unit cell of a lung or something akin to it. We have a shared airway atrium, we have budding alveoli, and it's ensheathed in a vascular net that has hundreds of vessel segments and junctions. We were able to build this inside of the gel. You can see the gel being ventilated. We're perfusing in deoxygenated red blood cells. They're getting oxygenated as a function of that transport. We can now go more complicated, where we're taking the computational approach of getting the architecture, first growing the airway, then growing the inlet and outlet vasculature, then populating the tips of the branches with these fundamental unit cells. So here, now we've gone more complicated. We have this Voronoi unit cell helping the blood perfuse around there, getting oxygenated. We actually showed that some of the blood in these architectures was exhibiting bidirectional flow through individual smaller segments. These vessels are about 350 microns in diameter, and that also we think is helping to boost the mixing and may provide an avenue for us to evaluate this further in the future. So since that work, we've now been endothelializing the topologies, getting these endothelial cells that normally line your blood vessels. They regulate transport, but they also prevent blood from clotting. We know we're gonna have to endothelialize these architectures. And then we've been putting actually lung cancer cells in the intervening areas, also used as a model, not just of physiology, but also of pathology. So we could fill up these chambers with cancer cells shown in yellow around the vasculature that's endothelialized in green. And we see now that the lung cancer cells are beginning to proliferate as a function of their distance from the vasculature. This is going to really help us understand more of that relationship between structure and function, looking at these cells invading the vasculature under intravasation, as well as migrating towards the vasculature. So overall, we're looking at taking organ architecture, breaking it down into its substituent components, analyzing that, and generating new architectures from scratch on the computer, and then generating the 3D printing techniques and workflows that will allow us to generate the overall structure. So with that, I'd like to thank the rest of the team, especially the trainees that have been leading this up, Robert Gregorian, who is a co-founder of Volumetric, Sam Paulson, Dan Sazer, and newer members, Maddie Royce, Sharina Malkani, Kristen Means, Ian Kinslinger, and Kevin Jansen. If there's time for questions, I'll be glad to discuss further. Thank you.
Jordan, that really was a spectacular interspace presentation. Truly remarkable work you're doing in your laboratory at Rice University. I was just speaking with Dr. Safdar here, and hopefully there are some folks at Lung Biotechnology that are watching you today. Maybe take 30 seconds or so and tell us about your work with Lung Biotechnology. I think you have some funded work with them.
Oh, great. Yeah, we've loved our work with Lung Biotech, and we share the same mission of generating replacement organs, particularly focused on the lung, and using 3D printing as an avenue to push that forward. So yeah, we have a funded project from Lung Biotech on studying and developing and endothelializing these architectures, and excited for more work coming out actually this next month, publication on this endothelialized network structure, as well as some future work going even higher resolution.
Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you, Jane, for making the introduction. We appreciate it. So let's moving on to our next speakers. We're now going to take you to outer space. This will be the outer space component to our presentations. And what I'd like to do is introduce the introducer. If we can go back to my slides, please. So yes, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Hess. Mike has been a Pumps and Pipes advisor also for a number of years. He is the Operation Integration Manager, Commercial Crew Program at Johnson Space Center. And in fact, that group has had just some wonderful launches and recovery over the last month with the Dragon 2 launch, and also which was on April the 23rd, and then also the Dragon 1 crew landing, which was on May the 2nd. And that picture was sent to us by a captain on a drilling barge in the Gulf of Mexico. And I call it the Earth, the Moon, and a dragon. It's just a wonderful picture. And so, Mike, hopefully you are on our Zoom connection. I think you are. And please introduce our next speaker, which is Matt Unler from Axiom Space.
I can't hear your audio, Mike. Great. Anybody hear me?
Hey, can you guys hear me? I got booted out for a second.
Oh, you're back. Good to see you, Mike. Go ahead with the introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I was good and ready to rock and roll, and I got pulled back into the prep room.
Adventures on Zoom.
So, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right, very good. Well, I've known Matt for at least 17 years, but I know he's worked at NASA for at least 28 or so years prior to him leaving NASA for other opportunities. He's got over 35 years of experience in engineering, management, and leadership, both in government and industry. He is formerly the president and CEO and founder of Houston Mechatronics, which was a fast-growing robotics and automation company that was local here in Houston, developing commercial robots and a host of technologies and applications. He grew that from startup all the way to over 60 million valuation under his leadership. He also worked for a period of time as a senior executive with Stinger Gafarian, again, a large technology corporation that has operations here in Houston. He was doing business development, strategic planning, program management, and corporate initiatives. But Matt currently serves as the chief technologist for Axiom. And we're going to hear a good presentation from him now. Of course, I see Matt mostly at the Home Depot. He always has projects going on, and he's always hitting the throwing a backpack on and going out to the woods. So I'm sure his discussion here about what's going on with possible future space stations is going to be very interesting. Take it away, Matt.
All right. Thanks, Mike. And good to see you. It always reminds me what a small community aerospace is. Run into the same people over and over again for sure. Well, let me start sharing my slides, which is always a bit of nerve-wracking. Will it work? You can see those, I hope. Everyone see that okay? Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Matt.
Looks good, and you sound good, Matt.
All right, very good, very good. That's sort of the phrase of the 20s, isn't it? Can you see my slides and can you hear me? Well, I really am privileged to be here and chat with you about what Axiom Space is doing. And this shows a rendering of our station that we will be building off of the forward part of the International Space Station. We'll be building it off what's called Node 2, which is the forward port of the ISS. We won that opportunity last year and have been running fast ever since to build a team and all the facilities needed to build a spacecraft. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the space station a little later and just talk more in general about what we're doing and why as we go forward here. The usual disclaimer. This, as you can see from my picture on the video, this is not my hair blowing in the wind, but we are, our vision is to build a thriving home in space that benefits every human everywhere. And we really have taken that to heart, and we want to build a space infrastructure and a space industry that really benefits everyone everywhere. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that takes place in several slides to come. So our first step to realize that vision is to build the first commercial space station. So as I mentioned, we won the opportunity to build our space station off of the forward node of the ISS. And it's it's a great opportunity, to be partnered with NASA and to benefit from all of the lessons learned over the last 20, 25 years of flying the International Space Station. But it also gets us an easier foothold into low Earth orbit. It's like going camping, but you have running water and electricity. So you don't have to have everything that you need right away. You can really benefit and leverage what's there on the ISS. And so this picture shows 3 of the modules that will fly eventually to the ISS. We will fly 4 modules total to the ISS, and I'll show all of those in a second. But I wanted to show at the bottom will be this thing we call the Earth Observatory, which are the largest space windows ever attempted and the largest space windows in the solar system. It's going to be this really, really unique place to hang out and observe the Earth and to get that effect that so many astronauts talk about when they fly, this realization that it's one planet, that there is no artificial boundaries between countries. It really is one planet that we need to take care of and learn how to work together on. And so that Earth Observatory is going to be a great place, I think, to realize that. And again, I'll talk a lot more detail about the station that we're building here in a little bit. One of our missions, of course, is human spaceflight. And we actually, not only do we have this agreement with NASA to build our station off of the ISS, but we actually have another agreement that allows us to fly private astronauts to the ISS. And we're doing that first flight next January. And our goal is to fly private astronauts that are looking to advance their own research objectives or their own philanthropic objectives, and you'll see a little bit more of that in a little bit, but also to open up space to every country on Earth, and not just those that participate in the International Space Station. And so there are a number of countries that are interested in flying their own professional astronauts because it brings a certain prestige to the country, but it helps stimulate science and technology, engineering and math education in that country, which, you know, I think we really need more of in every country on Earth for sure. And we also think that there's a third class of astronauts that will fly, which are dedicated to particular commercial endeavors. It might be a researcher from Johnson & Johnson who's trying to scale up some manufacturing in low Earth orbit and take advantage of the unique microgravity environment there. And so we hope to be flying those kind of commercial astronauts as well. This is our first, what we call the X1 crew. This is our first flight to the ISS, and again, it's next January. The commander is a former NASA astronaut, flown 4 times, Michael Lopez Alegria. He's Axiom vice president. And then the other 3 are what I described earlier as these private astronauts who want to advance their own charity causes, their own research causes. And so a really good group of individuals who share our vision and want to make a significant impact to people that live on Earth. And so they're taking this opportunity to advance some of their causes next year when we fly to the ISS. And I've alluded to some of this. You know, there's really 3 major threads that we think we are on the cusp in the world to really realize some tremendous advantages. And the reason we're on the cusp is because of advances in technology, some of which are the lessons learned from flying the International Space Station for the last 20 years and flying humans on board for the last 20 years. Some of it are advances in commercial space like SpaceX and Blue Origin and others that are building more and more capable and commercially available launch services. So we'll be flying humans to space and opportunities to continue human space flight. And those are either, again, as I mentioned, private astronauts or professional astronauts from countries that don't necessarily participate in the ISS. But also we hope after the retirement of the ISS that we fly NASA astronauts as well. And then the middle one, these commercial on-orbit services, is the one I really am excited about. I think there are unimaginable things that we're going to be able to manufacture in microgravity once the capability or the infrastructure is there that really enables that. And that's really what the commercial space station can provide, is an opportunity for companies to scale up manufacturing, to make things in space that can't be made on the ground. And I think 20 years from now, we will every day live with products that we can't imagine how we live without. And those products will be manufactured in space and manufactured in the unique microgravity environment of space. And certainly we think too, there'll be continued research and technology development, you know, in some cases for NASA and for national space endeavors. The low Earth orbit is still a hard place to get to, but it's a lot easier to get to than the moon or Mars, and testing out technologies that you want to take to the moon or Mars or beyond is much easier done in low Earth orbit, and we hope to be a platform to do that as well. And then the last little bit is a place where we can do brand and media partnerships. You know, those are things that NASA is not allowed to do. NASA is not allowed to promote certain businesses, and we think there's lots of opportunities for those sort of things as well. Again, I think they benefit all of us because they bring more awareness to the opportunities that space brings. And so we're excited about those things as well. And talk a little bit more about the on-orbit research. There's really been some amazing things done on the ISS in terms of research toward new products, new materials, 3D bioprinting, and things of that nature. But I think there's probably thousands of other things that weren't tried on the ISS because people weren't sure where to take it if it was successful, because there was no place to further the manufacturing of that thing if it did turn out to be something viable. And so a commercial space station allows those types of researchers that may not have participated in the ISS because they didn't see a growth path, but we now will provide them a growth path that if they discover something that they feel has commercial value and want to scale up their manufacturing, we're a place where they can do that. The on-orbit manufacturing piece of that is really, really exciting. Creating new alloys, new materials, 3D printing of biomaterial. There's just so many things that are possible. There's already been demonstrations of fiber optic cable that has 100 times transmission length, been demonstrated on the ISS. And so I think in many ways, the things that we will manufacture in space are as difficult to predict as it was to predict the applications on your iPhone 20 years ago. It's hard to imagine all the apps that you use today, to imagine that 15 or 20 years ago. And I think the same will be true. Once there is an infrastructure, a commercial space station and a commercial infrastructure, there'll just be hundreds of applications that emerge that we can't imagine today. But in general, any application that suffers from or has to be controlled against gravity or buoyancy and certain thermal characteristics, all those can be taken away from the problem when you're in microgravity, and therefore any process that sort of suffers from those limitations has the promise of being a viable thing in microgravity. And then, as I mentioned already, deep space exploration support. Again, it's still hard to get to low Earth orbit. It's still hard to get to space, but it's much, much easier to get to low Earth orbit than it is to get to the moon or to Mars. And so being able to test out systems, to be able to advance technologies in low Earth orbit is going to be a viable opportunity. And so we're looking forward to making our station compatible with those sort of technology developments as well. This is a bit of an eye chart, but it sort of summarizes all those things, and these are just the things that we can imagine so far, and a lot of it opportunities that we've seen of research demonstrated on ISS already. But I do believe, as I mentioned, I think there's a whole host of other research that could have happened on ISS, but probably didn't, because those particular researchers didn't see a path beyond the basic research. And a commercial space station gives them a path beyond the basic research, and I think will entice them to rethink about doing things in microgravity and low Earth orbit. And so here's the plan that we have ahead of us. As I mentioned, we're going to fly 4 separate modules to the ISS. And again, it's just a fantastic opportunity that we have to build our station off of the front of the International Space Station. It is just technically easier to build a station in that way. And so we're very proud of our opportunity with NASA. And so the first module is what we call the HAB, or Hub 1. And it has 4 crew quarters, space for all of the systems that you need to keep crew alive, and then also has places where you can do research, their payload capability. The important part of it also is that it has these 4 radial ports in the front, and those radial ports allow us to continue to expand onto our station. And then about 9 months later, in 2025, we'll fly our second module up, and it will be attached as shown. And then the third module comes about 6 months after that, and that third module is what carries also the Earth Observatory, which has been repositioned here to the nadir port of HAB2. Again, going to be an amazing place to see the Earth. This third module is dedicated entirely to research and manufacturing work. So it's really the workhorse. The other two are more living quarters and places to house private astronauts, as well as all the systems required for life support. Now, at this stage, we're getting power and some thermal control from the International Space Station, and we will get a communication link through the ISS, at least through the second module. But when the fourth module arrives, the power thermal module, we will then have the capability to be completely independent of the ISS. And so it has large solar arrays. Here's an example of advances in solar array technologies. Simply through advances in solar array technology, we can generate about the same power that the ISS can generate with about 1/6 the area of solar arrays. This tower will also have an airlock, which allows us to do spacewalks from, and by then we'll also fly up our own robot arm and be able to add modules with that robot arm. So then at some point in early 2028, we will separate from the ISS. We're hoping that we reach some agreements with NASA, and maybe we take a few things that they think are still valuable with us so that they can continue some of their basic research and technology development. And then we continue to build onto our station. Really, there's no limitations to how many modules we can add. Each of the first two modules have 4 different radial ports that can be added to and added modules to. And then we also think that we'll be building inflatable modules and at some point even constructing the modules in space. And the advantage of doing that is that you're not limited by the launch vehicle volume constraints at that point. We even have some designs and are talking to some really interesting technology developers about 3D printing in space at a very large scale. And so I think the future is going to be really, really amazing. And this pictures really just show the very beginning. And so that's our plans for the Axiom station and the markets that we're going after, and really, really appreciate the opportunity to tell you about it. Always excited to tell people about what we're doing.
Taking us into outer space. I do have a question for you. I see my camera just went on. Thank you again for your presentation today. I do have a question for you. Maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds. What was it like working with Felipe Stark?
Oh, it was very interesting from an engineering standpoint. And we're continuing to work this problem, because if you look at the interior of the ISS, it's probably the farthest opposite you can get from Felipe Stark, right? The inside of the International Space Station looks like a crazy person's garage. And Felipe Stark had a certain vision for an aesthetic that we don't normally think about as engineers, but it's something that we're trying very hard at Axiom to create a station that is functional, but also has a certain look and feel and appeal to the human element.
So just a note, Felipe Stark is just a visionary designer. He lives in Paris, France. His studio is in Paris, France, and he designs yachts, hotels, furniture, jewelry, anything that a designer does. And the fact that you linked up with him to help with the design of your module for your 21st century space station, I think is just remarkable. I think that's really one of the most interesting parts of the story about Axiom, actually, and what you've done. So, Matt, thank you again for joining us today. It's
Sure.
Very much. So, moving on in the program, the next segment is the Earth segment, and really kind of is going to focus on the ocean. The Earth is a water planet. And so if we could go back to my introductory slides, please. the presenter for our next talk is Rustam Modi. Rustam is once again, he's now a Pumps and Pipes director. He was an advisor for Pumps and Pipes for many years. He worked at Baker Hughes and retired for a short period of time, but is now the CEO of Vintech Nanomaterials. Rustam, I hope you're on the line. I think that they made the they made the Zoom connection with you, and take a minute and perhaps talk about this Washington Post article that we saw just maybe a little over a month ago, and how we made this connection with Saildrone, and then introduce our next speaker, Angel Margalariz.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for the kind introduction. On April 13th, a story in the Washington Post about high-tech robotic surfboards caught our eye. We kind of found that very interesting. And after reading the story about a company, Saildrone, and its technology, we decided that they would be a very good addition to the Pump and Pipes conference. So let me take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Anne Miglari. She is a Saildrone Program Executive Officer for Impact Science, and has spent a career promoting satellite, remote sensing, and geographic information systems that improve the collection of the environmental data about our planet, especially the ocean. Prior to joining Saildrone, she founded the Radiant Earth Foundation, a hub that collects and shares open satellite imagery data of the Earth, and also served as a president and CEO of Fugro Earth Data and Planet IQ. Thank you, Anne, for joining us today and talking about drone vessel mapping of ocean carbon data. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen this time. Hopefully this works. Okay. Can you see that now? Can you see the screen?
Yes, go full screen.
Oh, okay, perfect. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As mentioned, my name is Anne Miglari. I run Impact Science for Saildrone, and
please go to full screen.
Really happy to be able to share our technology and our mission with this audience. So we have been in business for 6 years. We're still a startup, if you will. We're based right on San Francisco Bay in Alameda, California. We design, manufacture, and operate all of these drones. We're in an old Quonset hut on the old Navy base. As you can see, this image here shows you the manufacturing floor. We work with the local community to train individuals on how to help us build.
And this is Steve in the studio.
The actual hardware itself. And clearly, being located right next to Silicon Valley, we have the opportunity to work with a lot of really talented software individuals. This drone is environmentally friendly. It's powered by solar and wind energy. It's all artificial intelligence enabled. We have secure data portals. And again, we're based in California. Give you a feel for the type of data that we collect. Ocean data, meteorological and oceanographic information, wind, pressure, radiation. We look at dissolved oxygen and temperature of the water. We look at sea surface temperature. We look at chlorophyll A, waves. We have cameras, 4 cameras on every Saildrone. And we can also do acoustic sounding, whether it's for bathymetry or to track fishery stocks. So this is the basic outline of what one of our drones looks like. There are other sensors, depending on what the customer might require for their mission, that we can also integrate into this platform. I'm happy to say we now have 3 different versions. The Explorer version, which is 22 feet long, has been working the ocean now for over 5 years. It is the backbone of the organization. We have 100 of those manufactured to date. And I'll show you some more examples of what the Explorer does, but it's mostly around meteorology, oceanography, and fisheries work. Our Voyager sail drone is 32 feet long. It is particularly outfitted for machine learning and for maritime domain awareness. And then finally, the big one, the Surveyor, we have one of those in final testing right now. It is 72 feet long, again, uncrewed, and is capable of mapping highly accurate bathymetry up to 7,000 meters. So these are the 3 types of vessels that we've manufactured and operate. Again, the smaller one, the Maritime Domain Awareness, is a vertical for us. Ocean mapping, bathymetry, highly accurate bathymetry data, and then ocean data, particularly around climate change, carbon, as was referenced in the Washington Post article, fisheries analysis, tracking sharks, tracking crabs, you name it, we can do it. And most of our customers there are the large science organizations around the globe. Why sail drone? This is a budding technological area. There are a lot of startups, plenty of competition in the space, but I can say happily, we are proven, capable, and trusted. We've had over 10,000 days at sea. We've only ever lost 1 vessel. We've sailed over 500,000 miles. We've collected over, roughly by now, this slide's a little dated, at least 500 million samples. And we have a global footprint. We have sailed in all of the world's oceans, particularly in the most difficult oceans. Our maritime domain awareness, well, what does that really mean? What are we looking for? We're looking for illegal fishing. We're looking to monitor the exclusive economic zone. We're prototyping this for the United States Navy and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, border security, and harbor security. Each one of these drones has 4 cameras on board. We've spent the last 4 years taking those images and having those classified as training data to be able to identify ships at sea. And we do machine learning on what we see on the horizon and target detection. We can determine whether the vessel we see on the horizon is signaling out their AIS signal. And if so, does that AIS signal match with what that vessel should look like? And if not, if they are not transmitting an AIS signal, that's an automatic flag for why a vessel would be going dark. So we have a radar system on this drone, 360-degree optical array of sensors, infrared cameras as well, and passive acoustics. It's quite a very capable machine. Our ocean data drones, this is actually in Dutch Harbor. As you can see on the right, we routinely collect data such as salinity, alkalinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen. That more colorful image in the bottom right is actually a fish stock assessment using an echo sounder. I'd like to reiterate that, again, we have 0 carbon footprint with this vessel. We routinely operate in the Arctic. This will be our 6th consecutive year in the Arctic. We were able to sail. Usually we ship these. We can put 3 on a cargo, typical truck bed or in a container. And usually we do that. But because of COVID, we actually have been sailing to the Arctic from Alameda, from San Francisco Bay. We've deployed over 26 of these vessels in the Arctic and done a cumulative 150,000 miles. We're collecting in the Arctic. Really, there are 2 missions that are of interest. One is bathymetry, so very little of our oceans have been accurately mapped for bathymetry, but we're also doing fish stock assessment. That was a mission we were able to accomplish during the pandemic, which cod and haddock are the 2 biggest fisheries in the U.S., and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has to set a limit every year, the number of commercial fish that can be taken. NOAA was unable, National Marine Fisheries Service was unable to get out last year because of the pandemic. And we were able to go out with these drones and give them enough information to allow the fishery to go forward. This, though, is the mission I want to speak to, and it was the precursor to the mission that you saw in the Washington Post article. This is a mission that we conducted last year, or year before in 2019, where we circumnavigated the Antarctic, which is no small mission, those being some of the most violent seas globally. It has always been a premise that the ocean is a sink for carbon, and we are relying in our global carbon models and projecting forward that the ocean will continue to be a sink. But because this data is so difficult and so dangerous to collect, really those assumptions are based on a very, very small data set. So our mission here was to circumnavigate the Antarctic and the Southern Indian Ocean and the South Pacific Ocean and measure carbon. And as you can see by this graphic, that assumption that the Southern Ocean is a sink is incorrect. It is actually outgassing significantly carbon through a large portion of the year. So this science paper was published just recently. It has been a big story in the carbon modeling community, and it also received the Ron Brown Innovation in Science Award for the team at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that we worked with. We are designing a very similar mission for the Gulf Stream off the East Coast between the US and Great Britain. That western boundary current is also a very difficult sea, a violent sea in the winter. And we have very few observations on that. So we were lucky enough to receive an award from Google.org for a significant portion of this mission. We're out raising funds for the rest. But we will put 6 drones in the Gulf Stream for a year, and we will crisscross that current for these exact same measurements to try to determine and help refine our global carbon models. In addition, we will send all of that data in real time to the European Commission on Medium Range Weather Forecasting. ECMWF is their acronym. They are, and I used to work for NOAA, so I can say this, they are the premier global weather forecasting organization. They are the most innovative weather forecasting organization. They also believe the biggest source of error in their global model and their regional model for Europe is not knowing where the Gulf Stream is and what the conditions of the Gulf Stream are. And so we'll be sending that to them in real time, and they'll be incorporating them into their forecast. Just the bathymetry mission, this vessel, 72 feet long, uncrewed, is the largest uncrewed vessel on the ocean. It collects the highest quality oceanographic data, meets all international standards, up to 7,000 meters. Finally, all of our data is paid for. Our impact science data, which is what I do, and what that means is science paid for by philanthropy, is all online and available for anyone who would like to use it for their missions. and gather more information about areas of the ocean that they're interested in. And so you can find it at data.saildrone.com. It's all in the cloud. It's all in the AWS cloud. It all has compliant metadata. And who are our customers? The United States Coast Guard, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and the likes that you can see on this slide, many oceanographic organizations. Now that we're up and running and working at scale, we're also looking to work for the commercial sector, for the shipping industry, for the weather forecasting industry, offshore oil and gas, offshore wind. So with that, I hope that gives you a little bit of flavor about Saildrone. I want to thank you for your time and the opportunity to present to you today. Thank you.
Anne, thank you very much. That was spectacular. We were fascinated when we started hearing about Saildrone and dug into it a little bit deeper. And quite frankly, when Rustin and I reached out to you, we were amazed that the contact with you came back literally within a day of setting this up. So thank you very much for joining us today and telling us about what Saildrone is doing.
Thanks for having me.
So our next speaker, we're going to go back to inner space on this one. I wanted to make a comment first before we do that. Recently, last month, we did a lunch and learn, one of our lunch and learns with HISD, and we did this on dog noses in medicine. And we had Dr. Cynthia Otto from University of Pennsylvania, and we had Maria Gudovich join us for that. We've had so far, and this is as of yesterday, 736 YouTube views on the DeBakey CV Education channel and on the Pumps and Pipes channel. And more importantly, we had over 700 students watch the event live. So we were excited about that, and we hope that a lot of students were watching us today. So our next speaker is Dr. Keith March. Dr. March and I met literally in the pericardial space 24 years ago. I had developed a device for accessing the normal pericardial space, and he used that device to do many studies regarding pericardial drug delivery, particularly to the coronary arteries. And what Keith is going to talk to us today about is not the pericardial space, but he's going to talk to us about cell secrenome therapy. Keith is the director of the Center for Regenerative Medicine at the University of Florida School of Medicine, and his talk is going to be on harnessing the power of stem cells, especially the secreted factors of those stem cells, for treating the heart, the brain, and the lung. Keith, good seeing you, and take it away.
Good to see you as well, and thank you for that introduction, how we met quite a few years ago. Let me see if I can successfully share the screen as well.
We see your slides. Can you go full screen?
How about there?
Yes, I think so.
Are you seeing full screen?
No. Swap. Tell him to hit swap display.
Huh?
Tell him to hit swap
Yes?
display.
No?
Well, I'm not sure if we were seeing that full screen or not. Now we are. Very good.
Okay, super. Well, Steve, as I said, I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be reconnected with you after, as you said, 24 years. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is about secretome. That is the material that the cells secrete when we're interested in a variety of stem, progenitor, and other types of cells that are having a great deal of potential in many areas of medicine, including, as you asked me to talk about in particular, things to do with the lung, brain, and heart. We've looked at a number of other areas, but I'll be sharing in particular some of our data on that. And of course, I'd be happy to talk to anyone who hears this presentation in the future if they want to have more expanded information about that or any of the other material that we've worked on. In terms of disclosures, I did found a company a number of years ago based on work in our laboratory related to therapeutic secretome, and that company is known as Theratome Bio, and I'll probably refer to it later on in the talk. If you think about cell therapy in general and how it's evolved over the last decades, certainly the first generation of many areas of cell therapy involved autologous, non-expanded cells. So cells out of one's own body, whether derived from fat, bone marrow. These are great repositories of stem cells or stromal cells. The second generation, I would say, would be allogeneic cell products, meaning from another donor. One great example of a use of that kind of adult stem cell is that derived from umbilical cord, whether cord itself, the tissue, or cord blood, or from other donors, say bone marrow, for example. And oftentimes those cells could be expanded in culture, so allogeneic and expanded. I think the next generation really is comprised of the cell secretome. That is, all the things put together that the cells will secrete that we've uncovered initially. And now most of the groups in the field would recognize that in many, many circumstances of therapeutic application, the key element of the therapy is mediated by those factors that the cells actually secrete. So by way of outline of the talk, I'm going to talk about the role of ASCs in particular, which is where we've done most of our work, that is the adipose or fat-derived stem stromal cell, and how they really act as a paracrine secretory factory, the evolution of that hypothesis, of how they function, followed by talking a bit about the neurological targets and also the pulmonary targets, and then the cardiac targets and how these might be helpful to enhance transplantation. This is a picture showing our very first in vivo experiment with an intramuscular injection of human adipose stem or stromal cells. In this context, we were using an immunocompromised kind of mouse called the NOD-SCID mouse and injecting those cells either to treat the leg that had received interruption of its blood flow, thus creating something that essentially is a model of peripheral vascular disease and the resulting gangrene, either treating with the cells on the left or with medium, that is just carrier saline solution basically on the right. And you can see that the administration of the cells markedly improved the viability of the foot, thus changing essentially a gangrenous entire foot to just the tips of the toe as a much better viability. That was our first result in the time frame of 2002 and 3. We were very excited about that. And when we went looking for those cells, if we labeled them with green fluorescent protein, which is a way of tracking them, we could see that the green fluorescent cell labeled here, seen in the green, were adjacent to the blood vessels, the small blood vessels in the leg muscles, which are marked here in red. But they were not part of those muscles and they were not part of the blood vessels. So what we learned was, unlike what people in the field were saying a lot those days, it was necessary that the cells would become part of the structure. These stem cells were in fact behaving not as the stem of a tree that gives rise to the branches, the fruit, the flowers. They weren't becoming those things, but instead were behaving in the function of a stem where they were supplying nutrients, supplying material that was helpful to the leg, to the muscle in this case. That was our hypothesis. So we went looking for paracrine factors, and these are what's called protein dot plots. Every one of the dots here represents a protein that's being detected at a fairly high level, a growth factor or a cytokine. I don't mean for you to look at all of these and remember them, but the point is a lot of factors are being secreted by the cells. And so that was what we actually talked about, that these were angiogenic, things that would grow blood vessels, and anti-apoptotic factors that would avoid cell death that were being secreted by these adipose stromal cells. And we proposed that that was in fact the majority of how they worked. At that time, we received some editorials around this concept that were friendly for sure, but also pointed out that we were being very countercultural because we were among the first 2, maybe 3 groups to point this out. And the first one in this particular cell type, that was a key aspect of how they worked. Now, that role of paracrine factors has gradually been recognized more and more in the field. If you just look at this timeline of the number of publications, you can see it's exponentially almost increasing in terms of the recognition of the paramount primacy of those factors in mediating what the cells do. Now, as I'll show you the function of these cells and their secretome in multiple disease areas, one way to think about understanding why they can have impact in so many different areas is to understand that these are the cells marked here in red that surround small blood vessels in the body. This is actually a blood vessel taken from human fat, and we've looked for the location of that stem cell, which we discerned the marker to be called a PDGF receptor beta, which is marked here in red by an antibody. And you can see it sort of hanging onto that blood vessel. You can kind of imagine both a chemical as well as a physical embrace. And this interaction with that blood vessel is what we think characterizes all blood vessels throughout the body. So that effectively, I think of these cells as the repair stations on the highways of the body, which are the blood vessels. And they're found everywhere, and thus we can conveniently harvest them from fat, for example, but they're everywhere else too, conducting a very similar repair function. And like repair stations have inside a lot of different tools and a lot of different machinery to do repair, these cells actually have similar tools, and they secrete those tools when necessary. These tools are the peptides, the proteins, the small molecule metabolites, and even miRNAs, microRNAs, mRNAs, and mitochondrial genetic material as well. So that secretome contains all these factors. And I like to use analogies. Another analogies, think of it like chicken soup. There are the soluble factors that are in the soup, and there are the floating around things, whether they're carrots or onions or other things, in this case called exosomes. And those factors mediate angiogenesis, neurogenesis, and inhibit apoptosis or cell death, and inhibit various aspects of inflammation. Those are, in fact, the key ways that the cells can work to effect an improvement over an injured circumstance, whether it's a pathological state, a trauma, whatever it may be. Something important to point out about this kind of approach that uses the secretome is that instead of a single factor therapy, such as is typically done either with a purified biologic or with a pharmacologic agent, as standard pharmacology is targeted with one particular target in mind usually, cell product therapy is much more like physiology. There's a whole host of different substances, hundreds, if not thousands, effecting change on a variety of targets. And so one instrument, in the case of music, another analogy, you could see a loud sound coming from, for example, a tuba. However, in the context of the cellular approach, these are secreting all these factors much more like an orchestra, each one having a more limited degree of sound, but creating on the whole a very nice symphony. And that's what I like to think of the cell approach as doing, whether we're using the cell or what they secrete, the secretome. So how do we prepare the secretome? Basically, we culture the cells in a protein-free minimal medium. We harvest that medium and we concentrate it. And so we have a concentrated preparation, which incidentally can be freeze-dried or lyophilized or placed into some other sort of a freezer, but not under liquid nitrogen, necessarily under cryostorage as the cells are. So they're much more readily able to be moved about and utilized. The first in vivo model we tried to test the effect of the secretome and therefore test our hypothesis to whether perhaps the approach of using secretome would work was a rat model. We tested this with our colleague Yansheng Du in his laboratory. We were not a neurological laboratory, but we had a great deal of interest in stroke and cerebral palsy. So this is a rat model where there is a unilateral ligation of the carotid artery, very similar to what I described earlier in legs. But here, after that ligation, after that interruption of blood flow, we simply provided secretome, not cells. And we found that here we see a cross-section of a normal rat brain, a dramatic loss of neurons seen with the interruption of blood flow, and dramatic protection that was effective both structurally and also functionally. I don't have time to show it here, but we did a number of functional studies of memory and muscle function and so forth in these rats and found that even though they had undergone the same blood flow interruption, the stroke that had occurred clearly in the control animals did not happen, and these looked at several months out or a month out were much improved structurally and functionally. The limitation of that stroke volume was also found to be dose dependent. You can see here on the left-hand panel, the more of this material was added intravenously, the less was the size of the stroke, from about 35% all the way down to less than 5% of the brain on one hemisphere. The behavioral score was also closer and closer to normal. And not only that, even survival was enhanced when the high dose material was used, so that we have hopes that in the context of stroke, survival would also be improved upon. Now, after a TAVR, if you look on the left side of this slide, TAVR being transaortic valvular replacement, through this catheter-mediated approach to an aortic valve, there's a great deal of embolic material, much of which is lost from the area of the old aortic valve. And as you saw in that little simulation, thanks to Rob Schwartz for providing it, there is the potential for embolism to the brain. And this is attended in more than 80% of cases, as is seen by multiple studies. These people will have brain injuries, which can be detected looking at a neurocognitive decline, a much smaller recognition of stroke initially, perhaps 1 to 3%, depending on the study. But if you look for it, perhaps 30% to 40% of people have cognitive decline. And as I said, more than 80 to 100% will have a brain lesion readily detectable by diffusion-weighted MRI. So that's an area where we expect to do a clinical study soon to take a look at the effect of the secretome, and that's something Theratome as a company is bringing forward. Also, ASC secretome we found significantly reduces inflammation and preserves barrier function in acute lung injury. So here we see an LPS-induced lung injury at 24 hours with cells, a markedly reduced degree of injury, but also with CM for conditioned media or secretome at the very bottom, 24 or 48 hours after that injury, again, a marked attenuation of the degree of inflammation. Most recently, we published just earlier this year, and this was actually brought forward by Michael Coleman, who's CEO of Theratome, that this secretome also can substantially reduce lung injury in the context of an influenza A-mediated injury. So also very effective to decrease inflammation and decrease the hypoxia that occurs in viral injury. And we're certainly interested in looking at that in the context of other viruses, COVID, for example. Now I want to move in the last part of the talk to talk about heart transplantation. The ischemic time of a heart significantly compromises transplant availability. And while we have a demand perhaps of up to 10,000 or more hearts per year, even some would say 50,000 people are waiting, and there are 10,000 donor hearts that through tragedy become available, only about 3,000 heart transplants are conducted every year. And the reason for that is twofold. One is pre-existing damage or some sort of an injury or perhaps disease in the donor. But another 3,000 of the hearts are not used simply due to projected time of ischemia prior to implantation. And that's because the maximum transport time that can be allowed is about 2 to 2.5 hours, so that there's sufficient time on each side for both the surgical removal and the reimplantation of that donated heart into the recipient. Those, of course, take some time. And that entire time of 4 hours is a period of time where the heart has no blood flow. You can think of it as having a whole heart attack. So both in animal hearts, using what's called the Langendorf prep, we are able to study, removed from the chest, what would happen to a heart when it's placed under exactly, and this is a mouse heart or a rat heart, depending, when it's placed into the circumstance of being in the fridge at 4 degrees centigrade in the transport solution that's used clinically, and then rescued from that after 4 to 6 hours or longer, and then we study its function. What we found after, for example, 6 hours is that when you compare the initial rate pressure product, which basically is an index of how well that heart contracts at baseline, compared to after the 6 hours in the refrigerator with the transport solution, you have a marked attenuation. And this is just time after reanimation of the heart. Here it is after secretome is added in mixed with the thing called UW, or University of Wisconsin solution, which is used commonly with other solutions as well as alternatives for heart transplantation. And you can see that in this rodent heart model, we better than double the function of the heart after that 6 hour time period. We've also looked at human heart cells in collaboration with our collaborator Pinar Zorlatuna at Notre Dame and Brad Ellis on her team, looking at these cells. You can see these human heart cells derived from what's called IPS technology, induced pluripotency, from actually white blood cells of humans. They were beating in this dish, and we look at that heart beat. It's mechanical, it's electrical, and it's beat rate, all these different kinds of parameters. And we can look at the recovery of that beat rate, again, after cold UW solution exposure. So what we find is that after exposed to that solution, there is a gradual recovery, just like you see clinically, of, in this case, a beat rate at 4 hours. But with the apposition or the admixture of the conditioned medium, the secretome, we get a much more rapid and robust recovery, such that if you go to 8 hours, this would be the recovery with UW solution alone. But with the application of the mixed conditioned media or secretome, we have a nearly doubling of that recovery, which makes 8 hours plus secretome look just about as good as 4 hours without the secretome. So we think we can double the length of the transplantation transport, thus making perhaps a doubling of available hearts. So in conclusion, we like to think of this, yet another analogy, like going from the coffee beans to the extracted coffee. That's like the secretome from the cells. So bottle the benefits, discard the cells. Instead of storing or brewing the beans or cells, we are bottling the coffee or secretome, serving up the therapy and leaving the cells behind. So in conclusion, a very prominent group of adipose and mesenchymal stem cell effects is mediated by the activity of their secretome, including in particular the exosomes. The factors have a very practical opportunity to limit a whole host of different diseases. I mentioned in particular the cerebral lesions after a TAVI. The ASC secreted factors secrete other inflammatory and ischemic diseases, and we haven't had a chance to address those today, but we'll certainly be happy to talk with you about them if you come to me by email or whatever means, and acute lung injury caused by viral infection. Lastly, I think we have an opportunity to advantage significantly the length of transport of multiple organs, including the one that we're working with currently, which is in fact the most sensitive to transport time, and that's the heart, thus augmenting the availability of precious donor organs. I do have a couple-minute video which I could present if you wish me to. It's totally up to you, Steve. So I'll conclude now, and you tell me if you'd like me, if you can break in, tell me if you want me to play the video about heart transplant.
So Keith, thank you very much. I think that we're running a little long today. I think we should probably just proceed, and what we can do is in our next newsletter, we can send people to this video and let them watch it. But thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been great to see you again.
Good seeing you. Thank you. So we're back in the studio, and I'm here with Dr. Joan Nichols, who's professor in the Department of Surgery here. Her laboratory is located in the Houston Methodist Research Institute. And we've got a little bit of show and tell here for you today, talking about lung bioengineering and lung regeneration. Dr. Nichols?
Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. I need to tell you a little bit about background material though, so you understand what it is that I do. So basically, a lot of what we know about how cells and tissues and organs function is really based on isolating cells from, well, organs or tissues, or even from organ-specific tumors. And so we work with these in culture, but putting a cell in a culture dish isn't the same thing as looking at a piece of tissue. There's no dimensionality to it. It's usually just one cell type, and you really need to have more to get a really good understanding of what the robust responses are of your body. And so a lot of the work that I do is modeling. That means, well, I take a support scaffold and I actually put cells on it. So here's a picture of what doesn't look very impressive, but this is actually natural long scaffold that has been cut into small pieces that I can add cells to and then create a small piece of tissue so that I can model responses, well, that would happen in your body. The scaffold itself, in this case, I've worked with lots of different scaffolds. Natural ones and synthetic ones. This is actually a natural scaffold from a natural lung, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you see how fluffy it looks and how nice. I take those small pieces of lung that we create using that scaffold or skeleton of the lung. By adding different kinds of cells to it, I can keep it alive in a bioreactor that looks like this one. Actually, we have one right here. So that bioreactor, it's small. It cultures one piece of tissue in it, and it lets you model things like, well, I can expose that small piece of lung to influenza virus or the virus that causes COVID and look at what the responses are of the tissue. I can also subject this piece of tissue to high levels of radiation, pressures that we wouldn't normally see in our lung, all different types of things that would affect how your lung response happen. I also, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have a question about this. This was originally developed to go to the space station?
This chamber is actually developed with a company that I designed what I needed, and they took what they had developed for the space station about 25 years ago and produced this for me to work with. The company is called Synthicon, and it was a NASA offshoot company.
Good. And so maybe if we go back to your slide, and we can show then how this particular device transitioned to what was really on the space station.
Well, that's big and heavy.
Yeah, big and heavy.
And I actually sent 35 pieces of lung tissue to the space station and then sent 35 back to my lab as ground controls. So what we actually had to do for the space station is this little pouch. It's a little Teflon pouch. It's lighter than my models. It lets the piece of tissue, and I can point to it in the middle, that would be, right now that's a piece of large lung scaffold that had cells on it that was fixed with something that keeps it from falling apart. And what we did is we sent this piece of live tissue in a media enclosed chamber to the space station, and then, well, once we sent the materials there, they went in a specialized incubator that was developed by a company called Cases, and the astronauts took that incubator and slid it into place on the space station, and that's actually the end of my work for a little while, and we moved to what the astronauts did. So
maybe we can introduce the astroscientists that actually did this
study.
So
the astroscientists, who are the lovely people that did all the work for me on the space station, because although my lab wanted me to fly there, I wasn't ready to. So we relied on Peggy Whitson, who was coming towards the end of her long period of time in space, and Randy Bresnik. And these were the two astroscientists that actually, on a regular basis, removed a small amount of media from around that piece of tissue, and at the end of each week, fixed each of those pieces of tissue for a return back to me to compare to my ground controls. So our actual experiment ran for about 6 weeks. And then the samples were stored until, well, to be frank, until the Dragon capsule containing the waste from the space station came back to Earth, and that's when they brought us back everything that I needed to get, and my experiment came back to me.
So let's take a look at the glove box.
So this is what it looks like when...
Let's go back to the slide. There it is.
There we go. It takes a minute to come up. So here is a picture of both Randy and Peggy working at the big glove box that existed in the space station. So the reason for a glove box is if anything floated away, they had to retain it. They couldn't let anything flow away, or if any of the media leaked out of one of my samples, you wanted to contain it, or else it would float around in the space station until the astronauts cleaned it up. And so you work in these specialized glove boxes to take the samples that are required, and at the end of each week to fix a set of these samples to return to me. So this experiment let us measure, well, what happens to your lung in space? We've concentrated a lot on what skeletal muscle changes and what changes happen in eyes of astronauts, but there hasn't been a lot of work to understand what happens to the lung. And it's kind of important because I don't know about you, but I breathe a lot, and I know they breathe a lot. And so you really want to know what happens to them while they're doing their time in space. Also, these models are small, they're inexpensive to make, and they could be sent to someplace like, oh, I don't know, the moon, and maybe someday Mars, as well as other little constructs like this made of heart and liver and all the other tissues that make us up, human tissue, not a mouse, and send them to these places and assess, well, what being in that environment does to you. Because in microgravity, your lungs change and your organs change. And in the radiation of low Earth orbit, you may experience changes in tissues that we didn't expect, and therefore radiation on other sites like the moon or Mars, we would actually be able to assess what that environment did to the tissues we wanted to look at.
So would you like to transition now to lung regeneration and transplantation?
Well, believe it or not, this project fits with this, because someday we're going to do made in space. We're going to actually bioprint in space, which we can't really bioprint a whole organ now, but someday we will be, and it may actually happen there. But basically, because we're not ready to do that yet, we did what we needed to do here, okay? And so when I talk about a natural lung scaffold, this is what I'm talking about. This is a pig lung. It's in a chamber like one of these that are surrounding me. These are bioreactor chambers. Actually, it's in one of the large ones. And this is a lung just after it was isolated, and it has cells in it, and it has blood in it, and we're going to pump through a mixture that is containing sugar and a detergent, which slowly over the 7 days that this process is showing you, this is time-lapse photography, you destroy all of the cells and remove even fragments of the cells in the DNA, and you also flush out all the red blood cells and destroy everything, and slowly you see the tissue of that scaffold becoming whiter and whiter. And that's at the end of this whole process. And you see the little rudimentary piece of a heart in the middle, the little pink spot? That's because the process is actually optimized for lung and not for heart. And so that's actually the process that we do to make a natural lung scaffold. So, hang on.
Well, we can play that one more time.
We're going to play it again.
Yeah, let's play that again.
Sorry.
Go back.
There we go. Come on. Technical difficulties. There we are. And so, well, we can stop here since I've got it at this point, and I can show you what a natural lung scaffold looks like at the end. This is a small lung scaffold, and I'm going to tip it up for you. What's nice is that it's a little dry, so it's sticking to the actual pan that we have it in. It has a trachea in the middle. This is not a biological. This is just the collagen and elastin, the proteins that make up the structure or the skeleton of the lung. And until we put cells back on it, it's not a biological. You can see the right and left side of the lung, and on this piece over here that you can't see really well, this is the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein component here. So one side is pulmonary artery and the other side is pulmonary vein. This is a natural scaffold made from a pig's lung itself, because this was part of a project that we did, well, to see if we could do preclinical studies that would someday lead to producing a lung that could be transplanted into a person. And so that's what you're looking at in the scaffold as it's being made, is you're seeing it as we flush out everything that is there. It's not going to let me do it. It's not going to run again.
That's okay. Well, let's move on to the next slide.
So the next slide is showing you one of the most beautiful ones we created. This is a very photogenic scaffold where we actually have it lit so that you can actually see through it, and it was newly produced. It isn't dried like this one yet. But we've developed a process, just like we did to get rid of the cells and blood that's in a lung to make a scaffold. We developed a process, or a recipe actually, that lets you build a new lung. It takes 30 days to do that, and we're not saying that we built a perfect lung. In this case, we built the best lung that we could, and that's a picture of the scaffold being placed in this small bioreactor chamber that you see right here. So this is for a single lung, and the big one that's on my other side is to produce a double lung set. So we start with a single lung, and it goes into this chamber, and every day for 30 days we put in a cell type, a product, a nutrient that the lung needs to have, factors that the lung needs to have to actually repair itself are very often very useful in doing this process, to create a lung for transplantation. And that's exactly what we did, is we created a lung for transplantation. So that scaffold, that same scaffold is in the next picture. That's a scaffold about 20 days into the process of producing a lung. You can see the control system on one side, the piece of equipment that's sitting there. There's the control system. And a reservoir on the other side that is the media reservoir for the media that leads into the tank in the middle. There's an oxygenator that you can't see that maintains high levels of oxygen or low levels depending on what we're doing in that chamber. And every day for 30 days we put in the respiratory cells, the trachea and bronchi and bronchioles, the vascular cells or the lung cells themselves, the lung epithelial cells, to create an organ that by day 30, and this is now looking in the incubator where we house it every day when we're finished doing a manipulation or an addition, and that is at the end of 30 days, and that actual lung was transplanted into an animal. This is part of preclinical testing to make sure that this process works. And so we actually made 4 lungs for transplantation into 4 different pigs. And the pig is a large animal model that we chose for this because my surgeon, who actually is a cardiothoracic surgeon, his name is Saverio La Francesca, was working here at the time. He's now at Stanford. He was the person who was planning on doing the transplant, and we wanted a large animal model because he wanted it as like people as it possibly could be. So it wanted something big enough. And it also tested our ability to make something large. At the end of 2 weeks, this is an image from that same lung, the scaffold that I showed you and the lung that I showed you in the chamber. You're seeing here a picture of it's a gross image of the lung as it's isolated. The bioengineered lung is small and it's labeled BEL. The native lung is there and it's the native lung of the animal. So I need to back up a second and tell you, the cells for this project to make the engineered lung, we made a single engineered lung. Animals and people can live off of one lung. So we isolated the cells from a lung removed from that pig during a pneumonectomy, and the cells from that same animal were used to construct the lung that I showed you that went back into that animal for transplantation after 30 days of bioreactor culture, and then was survived in that animal for 2 months. It's small. Just the same way I showed you, the scaffold I showed you is very small. That's a normal pig scaffold. It's small for 2 reasons. We don't get all of the cells out when we isolate the cells from a lung. We lose very many because they're damaged in the process. And the other reason is we wanted to make sure that this lung would grow over time. And so, basically, all I want to mention to you at the end are these are the people that were involved in either the Lungs in Space program or the lung regeneration team. And as you mentioned to me earlier, it takes a village to do this work. There are a lot of people that aren't listed here that did components on the side or not critical pieces of the project, but this is the team that made this happen.
Well, thank you, Joan, and thank you for bringing the hardware into the studio today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Apologies to our audience. We've gone, I think, 4 minutes over our limit. I hope you stuck with us till the end. If we can, maybe show one last slide, which is back to my slide deck, perhaps. Wanted to thank the production team, our Pumps and Pipes production team, and the DeBakey CV education team. We couldn't have done this without them today. There's probably 6 people in the studio and in the control room today making this happen. And then, of course, it does take a lot of other people to put it together. So thank you very much for joining us today for our Pumps and Pipes Tech Rodeo on inner space, outer space, and the earth between. Thank you.